background on Dahlia, very, very interesting. Dahlia Sherif has a bachelor's degree from the University of Waterloo in urban planning. She has a master's degree in urban community development from the University of Toronto, a certificate of project management from York University, and is trained in human-centered design. Dahlia has worked on the island of Bermuda, where she supported communities and new developments in their application of hurricane damage prevention, and closer to home was part of the multidisciplinary team who would redesign a massive community housing project in downtown Toronto. Her passion for advocacy led her to the Ontario Child and Youth Ombudsman's Office for 12 years, where she would contribute to passing historical motions through Parliament that seek to eliminate the inequities faced by Indigenous communities in Canada. Her work took her to the United Nations, where she was able to gain international attention for these ongoing issues, as well as being included in the Truth and Reconciliation Bentwood box. She's currently Regional Social Service Consultant at the Salvation Army in Toronto, and the title of her talk today is Truth and Reconciliation in Indigenous Communities. Dahlia, thank you so much for joining us, and we are looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Susan, and thank you all so much for welcoming me into the space today. I wish I could be with you all physically, but this will do. So I'm going to do my best not to talk forever. There's a lot to talk about when we talk about truth and reconciliation, so I will do my best to stick to the time. So I work with Glenn out of the Salvation headquarters in the Social Services Department, but today I'm going to be sharing with you my work that I did prior years to joining the Army. So before we begin today, I of course want to acknowledge the ancestral lands that I'm sitting on today here, the Mississaugas of the New Credit in Toronto. But beyond a land acknowledgement, I really want to take a moment to honor and acknowledge all of the murdered and missing Indigenous women in our country that often go forgotten. And today we carry them in our minds, and I ask you to carry them in your minds as you go about your day. So as I said, before I started at the Salvation Army a year ago, I was working with the Ombudsman in Ontario, advocating for children, youth, and their families. Indigenous children was my particular portfolio, and I spent a lot of time flying up to very, very remote communities, parts of Canada that many of us don't get to see. And it's in this work that it really ignited my passion for advocacy and equity in our country. However, I have to share a personal story with you that happened to me when I was a little child that I think I would like to say is my Indigenous Learning 101. When I was 7 years old, my dad was taking me to a festival. And I grew up in Ottawa, so Ottawa at that time was a fairly dominant white community. And we were going to a festival and we were driving around and around trying to find parking. I was so excited. I couldn't wait to go on the Ferris wheel. And, you know, we couldn't find parking. And so we're driving around and we finally find parking. And I'm about 7 years old. I'm just excited to go to the festival. But we soon found out that we weren't the only one looking for parking. And a gentleman aggressively approached us after we parked. He was a white man. And he started yelling at us and saying every racial slur in the book, telling us we didn't belong, told me that he didn't like the color of my skin or my hair to my father. He said that we needed to go back to our country, we don't belong here. That was very impactful at the age of 7. And I have to tell you, I was terrified about what was gonna happen next, because my dad is a hothead. And I was worried what he was gonna do. But in a really calm voice, my dad ignored his racial slurs and ignored what he said and took the opportunity to say, actually, sir, this is not your land either. We've been all welcomed here and that we do belong here. And I was shocked by that, and I was very impacted by that experience at such a young age, that someone was telling me that I didn't belong in this country when really this country, we've been all welcomed by the Indigenous people on this land. So I share that story with you because it really started the trajectory of my career. I had no idea, but it really influenced me as a kid. And the way that my father explained that we all belong really made me think of a quote that was said by Justice Marie St. Clair, who is the commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation. So thank you for listening to my quick little story. I'm going to start my presentation now, so just give me a moment. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, the road we travel is equal in importance to the destination we seek. There are no shortcuts. When it comes to truth and reconciliation, we are all forced to go the distance. So that experience as a kid and this quote kind of all comes together in what I hope we can all do together. We all must travel together on this journey. We are all Canadian. We all have this journey together to fight for truth and fight for reconciliation. So today I'm going to share with you a bit of work that I undertook advocating for Indigenous communities. So, why do we do this work? Well, we know that residential schools happened in Canada, and we know that the 60s scoop happened in Canada. Residential schools date back to the 1870s. Over 130 residential schools were located across Canada. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their homes by the RCMP. So just think about that for a moment. Those of you who have children, those of you who have grandchildren, nieces, nephews, imagine your children being forcibly taken away. So 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families. 90 to 100% suffered physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And of those schools, the last closed in 1996, not so long ago. So some quick facts to talk about the repercussions of what residential schools did to our Indigenous communities and the impacts. So here are some stats just to give you an idea of our current realities. 1 in 4 children in First Nations communities lives in poverty. That's double the national average. Suicide rates among First Nations youth are 5 to 7 times higher than other young non-Aboriginal Canadians. First Nations young people are more likely to end up in jail. We know that we have unresolved cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in our country. And like many of our communities, First Nations are also experiencing a housing crisis. So when we look at the disproportion of rates and the results, it's evident in our jail systems. So if you look at the first part of the graphic, Aboriginal Indigenous people only make up 4% of the population, yet they're 23% of the inmate population. That's significant. So the life expectancy of a First Nations citizen is 5 to 7 years less than other Canadians, and the infant mortality rate is 1.5 times higher. Tuberculosis rates are higher, and First Nations children who are in systems of care are also much more represented. So that brings me to the first project that I got the pleasure of working on that I want to share with you today. It was called Our Dreams Matter Too, and this is my baby project that took me to the United Nations. I'm very proud of this work, but I'm most proud of the young people who stood up to the UN and said, hey, there's something wrong and there's something happening in Canada. And even though we seem like this really developed, awesome nation, there are things that are happening that are wrong. So Canada is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's basically a document that lays out principles, and it's the rights of children in our country. So as a signatory, the government of Canada is held accountable to meeting the rights of children. And every 4 years, they go through a process where the UN will investigate how well Canada is doing. We went to the UN to tell them that we weren't doing very well. And I had, again, the pleasure of traveling with a group of Indigenous youth to the UN who collected 52 letters of students across the country to report on the inequities that young people face. So an Indigenous child, just because of the way they look, just because of their identity, they get $2,000 less. That's an extremely racist policy to say, just because you look this way, you're gonna get less education. So we went to the UN, reported this fact, and the results were young people coming forward and expressing that some communities didn't even have schools. Some communities were dealing with rat and snake infestations. Some communities were having their children go to school in portables in minus 40-degree weather with no heating. So needless to say, when the UN found this information out, they really blasted Canada and they said, Canada, you have to do much better. And what's most exciting and what I'm most proud of is out of holding them accountable, the government passed a historic motion called the Shannon's Dream Motion in the Parliament of Canada, which seeks to ensure that every child in this country gets equal education, no matter what they look like, no matter what their race is, no matter what their culture is. So we're very proud of that work. And these young people on the right pointing their fingers, proud, that is them right after finding out at the Parliament of Canada. Very proud moment. Next in line is talking about the main project, which this project, Feathers of Hope, is what helped to inform the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action that affect youth. So this project is something that we started 8 years ago. And we started by traveling to remote First Nations communities to hear from young people themselves. We knew the stats that I just talked about were speaking for themselves. We knew young people were struggling. And in fact, I'm not sure if many of you know, we have a suicide crisis in our country with some of the highest suicide rates amongst First Nations young people in remote northern communities. Often goes unreported because of the northern nature of where they live. So young people were really losing hope, and we wanted to do something about it as an office. So Feathers of Hope is a community-based strategy. It's a youth-driven initiative, and it's a framework for young people to be involved in the decisions that affect them. Governments, policymakers, businesses, constantly making decisions that affect our northern communities and young people themselves. We wanted to gather young people and governments together to say, speak to each other. We need to improve these realities. We need to improve the lives of these young people. So a movement started. We had no idea where this would take us, but it really took off, and now we are an international organization, an international movement that seeks to raise the voices of young people. So I hope to you now it's obvious why Feathers of Hope was created. Feathers of Hope was created to just provide some sort of hope, to let young people know that we are going to improve their education, that we care about those communities in the north. And we really just wanted to bring young people together with government so that they could hear directly from young people. So our goal was to inspire hope for First Nations young people, to challenge the perceptions that so many young people face, even the racism in our general population, to correct misinformation, and to emphasize the importance of youth in the future. That young people are our leaders, they are our future leaders, and that we had to invest in them now. What were the results of all this work? Well, we have young people who are, when they attended for the first day, they had their hoodies up, earphones in, not talking to anybody. They left speaking to the members of parliament, standing next to the RCMP, engaging in conversation and fighting for their rights. So such a simple act of giving young people the freedom to say your voice matters has such impactful results. Now, some of those people who attended that forum are lawyers, are politicians, and they are now speaking out about anti-racism, and they are now speaking out to the truth and reconciliation calls to action. They're making change because someone told them their voice matters, and sometimes that's all they need. We developed beautiful reports that were submitted to the Parliament of Canada and inducted into the Truth and Reconciliation Archives. These reports set out calls to action and recommendations for Canadian citizens, for government, and for the public, similar to the TRC's calls to action, but geared to youth. We were, as I mentioned, inducted into the Truth and Reconciliation Archives. These are our young people who fought together, standing side by the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Attorney General approached us to do a further investigation into why Indigenous people are so highly represented in our incarceration and justice systems. So we built another report and another documentary to educate others as to why these atrocities are happening. Young people, as I mentioned, were overrepresented in the child welfare system, and we too gathered a forum and another report to report on this. So our work goes on and the movement continues. However, I'll talk about why this is important. We've talked about it. We know that it's important that young people are the experts on their own lives. They have every right to be at these tables. And we had the luxury of the dollars and the funding to put towards this project because we were funded by the government of Ontario. But I have to sadly update you all that a year ago, I was laid off and our whole office was terminated by the government of Ontario. The Ford government had decided that there was no funding available for young people who fall through the cracks. And it was completely eliminated. And so our movement continues and these young people are fighting by themselves, but they no longer have the support of our new government. And, I think I just wanted to share that because I think it's important that we sometimes see these powerful trajectories and then they fail because there's no sustainable funding or there's no interest in really providing sustainable solutions. It's so important that we continue this work because these young people, especially in these COVID circumstances, are so isolated. It's very easy to lose hope in these very isolated communities, these remote communities that you can only access via a small airplane, no road access, no stores. We need to ensure that these young people do have hope. And so I also I'm rushing now because I realize I'm over time, but I'm okay? Okay. I do want to take the opportunity to just provide a moment to provide some small education on what happens to many young people. So because we have these systems where we don't have sufficient education on reserve, young people at the age of 14 have to leave their communities and go live by themselves in urban centers. So imagine a little 14-year-old saying goodbye to their mom and dad and going off like they're going to university, but actually it's just grade 9. So the reason for this is because we don't have adequate resources on reserve. We don't have education resources on reserve. So these young people fly miles and miles away from their families and they attend school in northern urban centers like Thunder Bay, I'll say as an example, in Ontario. These communities are often extremely racist and they struggle very hard trying to access education while being away from their family unit and their communities. And so something that I'd like to shine light on today is in Ontario, there is currently an investigation and an inquest into the deaths of 7 young people who have died between 2011 and 2015. That was a long time ago, and this is still happening, that young people are dying at schools that are funded by the federal government for Indigenous students. It's not well known in the media, and I'd like to take this opportunity for you to be inquisitive and check out why this is happening. So there is now a formal inquest by the coroner of Ontario to try and understand why these young people died. Why did they leave their home communities and at such a young age end up dead? So there is an inquest. Young people are at the table, and we hope that results will demonstrate that we need education to be stronger in our reserve communities so that young people don't have to leave their families. So I just want to acknowledge the young people who I stand behind in all of this work. They are the faces of this work. They are the young people who really led this. They held the government accountable and resulted in the historic movement, which the federal government committed to these young people and said, we're going to create a department just for Feathers of Hope. And so I'm proud to say that in the federal government, there is a department called Feathers of Hope that is just looking into improving the quality of life for young people who live in remote communities, as well as improving our education systems and creating equity in our education systems. So that's a really quick download of my work, of the work that these young people did. Happy to answer questions, and I encourage questions because I just rambled very quickly.
We'll open up to questions. I do have two in writing here while you were speaking, Dahlia, so I'll just read them out. What are the respective roles and responsibilities of the federal and provincial governments for funding and providing education to First Nations communities?
It's a great question because it's a hot topic. So the reason why it's a hot topic is because the government is in situations where it's a he said, she said situation. So if something happens where there's a lack of funding, it will be the federal government saying, oh, that's a provincial priority versus, and the provincial government will say the same thing back to the federal government. This happens so much that there had to be a creation of a policy called the Jordan's Principle. Jordan's Principle is a policy that was created because a young person died, because the federal and provincial governments couldn't get it together and couldn't agree on who required to pay for the medical bills of this young person who was in care, and unfortunately that little child died. So out of that young person's death came Jordan's Principle, which is a policy that ensures that no matter what, money gets put forward and all of the arguments will happen afterwards. So in a insufficient way, I'm answering the question by saying it's not clear. And the government still has to do a lot of work to delineate those lines of who's responsible for what.
Thank you. Another one that came in is, in your view, does the Federal Indian Act help or hinder the development of First Nations people in Canada?
Great question. Thank you for asking that question because it does hinder. We're dealing with an extremely archaic act, very racist, very archaic. And we have tried, actually, our office tried to get the government to a table to revise the Indian Act without success. So it definitely is hindering the process. It needs to be revised. It needs to be, I'm not saying abolished, but it needs to be revised, and there needs to be First Nations leadership at the table in the revisions.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, Dahlia, we have plenty of time. So if there's something that you've left unsaid that you'd like to say to us, please feel free. I have another question here. And by the way, everyone can unmute themselves to ask questions if you'd like. Can the new, quote unquote, digital world provide education online instead of shipping the children off?
Fantastic idea. I hope I hope that this weird world we're living in COVID has created opportunities to think outside the box on how we can have different types of education for young people in remote communities. So absolutely, I think that's a fantastic idea.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions?
Just as a reminder to anybody who's on the phone, it's *6 to unmute yourself.
I also have a question back for people if there's no other questions.
Please do, yes.
My question is have any of you been involved in awareness or advocacy around Indigenous issues? And if not, now hearing this, what might you be able to do to create awareness?
We're thinking furiously, as you can see.
It's kind of awkward crickets, isn't it?
Yeah.
But and I guess one of the things that is going through my mind is you provided us with a lot of information, which I really appreciated, and we have it evokes strong feelings in us, but I think that at this point in time we're really struggling to know or understand or develop what can we really do. And you're asking us the question, what are you going to do, or what are you prepared to do? And I guess I struggle with, okay, what can I do? What are the steps that I can take? What are the things that I can do to help in these issues?
Well, I'm so happy you asked, because I think a really simple starting point is, again, one of the awesome things that has come out of COVID is a lot of the universities and colleges are offering free programs. And so what I will do is, in the chat, I will cut and paste a link to the University of Alberta, and the University of Toronto, actually, who have both released online Indigenous awareness programming. So if any of you in the deep winter months of COVID are bored, you have something to do now.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dahlia. Are there any other questions for Dahlia?
Tom Burpee and I are both members of St. George's Church downtown, which acknowledges every week that we are built on Indigenous land. And we are having little conference sessions this month, I think, or next month, on Indigenous affairs.
Excellent. Great start. I see another hand up.
That is Tom, part of that church.
Yeah, excuse me. I've always been interested in the topic, but I've never had it explained the way you've just explained it. And I just wanted to say, it's opened up my understanding, which means that when I hear about it, read about it in future, I'll be much more open to trying to understand what's happening. So it's a really big step forward for somebody like me. And I appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And so in the chat box, I've just included a link to the University of Alberta's free online programming to take their Indigenous program, their Indigenous Studies program, which is free right now. It's so awesome.
Dahlia, I have a question. Have any of the federal government programs for COVID, the CERB, et cetera, have had any positive or negative effects on any of the Indigenous people during the time of COVID?
That's a good question. I'm not too aware of any negative impacts at this point. I think that remote communities are at risk in terms of actually when we talk about the virus spread. There is So when we think about what remote communities are equipped with, you'll go into a little fly-in airport with one building, and then they have a small portable for a nursing station. So if an outbreak happens in a northern community, they do not have a fair chance at fighting or quarantining even. You'll see in many reserved communities, because there's so much limited housing resources, you'll have 5 families in one house. So the idea of even isolating is difficult. So when the governments are talking, or when you see in the news that COVID has reached our remote communities, there's a different intensity of the severity of what that means, based on the fact that there's not enough resources to deal with the virus in those communities.
I was speaking mostly about the financial credit, the financial different programs that are available to people who are unemployed or who have no financial help. Has any of that affected positively or perhaps negatively to any of the peoples?
Yeah, unfortunately, I wouldn't know how it's affecting. So I would have difficulty answering that question. I'm sorry.
Any other questions?
I'd just like to ask Dahlia, we all know that the problem exists and it's a huge sore on our national history, but in your experience, have you sensed any progress or shifting of attitudes? I mean, it might be going from -100 to -93. I don't want to be too positive, but do you see the glacier moving at all?
I do. I absolutely do. And maybe I'm too hopeful. Maybe you asked the wrong person, Glenn. But I do believe that there's change happening. I started this work 12 years ago, and there wasn't the awareness that exists today. And I think that young people, there is a teaching in Indigenous culture that the 7th generation will rise and the 7th generation will prosper. And we're in the 7th generation right now of young people. And so for me, I find power in that teaching, in that it is now's the time that these young leaders are going to rise and they're going to continue that change. And that's what Feathers of Hope was all about, was equipping these young people at a young age so that they can make the change when they get to our age.
Thank you.
I also actually, Glenn, I also think that the commitment by the federal government to create a department is huge. I don't know if that would have happened 10 years ago. So I do think that we're getting a level of commitment and interest. Perhaps it's the Trudeau government, but there is a commitment to make change. And I think Indigenous communities themselves are making the change that they need to see.
How do you calculate the 7 generations? I'm not questioning you. I'm sort of doing at 30 years a generation. I started in 1867. So
yeah, so that's kind of
the 7th generation started in 1917. I'm just curious how you do the calculation, or how First Nations would do the calculation.
Well, we'd need to invite an elder in to give the teaching. I definitely can't speak to the teaching, but I think that that's another thing, and another, I believe, is it Anne? And you asked, what could I do? And that's, so many of you probably work in spaces where you can invite a guest speaker in. To invite an elder in is a whole other level of starting point. Just to invite them into your space, learn about their culture, learn about their teachings. Because it's so important also to recognize that when we say First Nations, I'm sure many of you know this, but it's not a one pan nation. There are thousands of communities across our country, different cultures, different teachings and practices, different clans. And so I encourage you all to connect with an elder, to connect with a community, to understand their unique skills and their unique stories.
Thank you, Dahlia. And if there are no other questions, we are grateful for the time you've taken to share, well, your heart and your expertise. But for extra eloquence, I'm going to call on David Franklin to thank you on behalf of the club. David, are you there?
David, don't forget to unmute your line, *6.
We not.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Dahlia,
Hi, I can hear you.
various members have already thanked you for your eloquent, informative, and passionate presentation. This subject really, in a broader context, deals with human rights. And a government is often judged, how do they treat their minorities? Our record is dismal, starting with the head tax on Chinese immigrants, the internment of Japanese, not Japanese, but Canadian Japanese during the war, the turning back of Jews during the war with the motto, one is too many. And now we live with, how do we treat your people, the Indigenous people of Canada, the First Nation? Understand what First Nation means. They are the first people. We are in their country. And immigrants came to settle on your territory. The story that you told when you were 7 years old had an enormous impact on your future. And you have dedicated your life to help others in the same situation. You know, this is a Rotary Club, and we have a branch, a club in Iqaluit. Maybe we can reach out to them and create a program where we can help those that live in the northern community. I only wish that you be invited back to our club, maybe in a year from now, to hear another report how things have improved. They will improve because of dedication of young people like yourself to help your fellow citizens. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, David, for that lovely outro. I really appreciate it. I appreciate so much for the fact that you all listened to me ramble quickly today. And Glenn, thank you so much for inviting me into this space.
Thank you again, Dahlia. We hope to have you back sometime with good news. With good news. We are none of our meetings would be complete without an announcement. So I'm going to just take care of some business now. Andy Durso, our own Andy, celebrated a birthday on October 18th. So Andy, we wish you all good things in the coming birthday year. Peter Starr had a Rotary anniversary, 23rd of October, 7 years with Rotary. We have a couple of announcements from Heather, and then we'll go over to Hogan. Heather?
Thanks, Susan. So I'm really pleased to announce that we're going to have a virtual pub night with a former member, Gary White. So he will be performing for us in aid of our fundraising attempts for our food baskets that we're going to be doing in December with, sorry, I've got duplicating in my ear. I apologize. So we are fundraising for our baskets that we'll be distributing in December to students of the Lester B. Pearson School Board in Lachine, LaSalle, and Verdun area. So that's going to be coming out on Facebook today, or later today and tomorrow with more precision. We do have a sponsor for the event, and it's going to be broadcast on Facebook. And it should be a great event. You will need a Facebook account in order to access it. But what I'm looking for right now is some volunteers to agree to be co-hosts so that it can be more widely shared via Facebook. I'm trying to think. Anne, can you think of anything that I'm missing for the announcement?
I think just to reiterate that you don't have to be a friend of Gary's on Facebook to participate in this. all you need is to have a Facebook account. Now, I think probably some or many of our members are not Facebook users, but you can actually just set up an account and you don't have to even invite friends, but as long as you have an account set up, you can access the Facebook link that is going to be going out. We're also going to send an email link so that even if you're not on Facebook, you can send it out to your contacts in your email, so people will be able to access it that way. I guess the other thing is, it is a fundraising event, but we will not be issuing donation receipts for it, so we need to make that clear. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
Anything else, Heather? We're good?
Oops. I think, yeah, the last thing is the more support that the club gives this event, the more likely of a success of it. So as soon as you get the details, please share it with your network. And it's a fun time. If you haven't seen any of Gary's previous virtual pub nights, it's Gary performing all kinds of songs that we know, and it's fun. And you can't go anywhere anyway, so like, why not stay in, have a beverage of your choice, and enjoy some great music.
Dawn is asking for the date of the pub night.
Thank you. That would have been really good to start with. Thank you, Dawn. It's going to be October 30th. We're doing it on the Friday night instead of Saturday night because Saturday night is Halloween. So it's the kickoff to the Halloween season, if you will. Halloween, I think, is not canceled in the city of Montreal, but it's going to be a different one for sure. So this is just a fun evening from the safety of your living room.
Great.
7 p.m. on the 30th.
Thank you. Thank you. Our 90th anniversary this year, and Hogan has a few words for us on that. Hogan, where are you? Did we lose Hogan?
I think we did. I don't see him on the list. Sometimes I think their internet connection goes out.
Oh dear. Okay. Yeah, he was there just a few minutes ago. Okay. Well, if he signs on, I'll let everyone know, but for the moment, he's not there. I know that Deborah is working furiously on the pamphlet that we're sending out. Deborah, do you have anything you want to share, or? Oh, you're muted.
Helping out, you've done a lot, and Jim and I and Susan are working on something, and more to come.
Okay, super. Thanks so much, Deborah. Okay. Any happy news or happy bucks? Anything to share? There's Rod. There you go.
Well, I have two. First of all, on Sunday afternoon, this first time I played golf on a Sunday, I played with Andrew Carter of CJD Morning Man, and we had fascinating conversations. And since we're having Bill Brownstein from the printed word of the Gazette to speak to us, it might be an idea to invite Andrew Carter at some point to talk about the radio world. And then secondly, I'll follow up with you on that. Okay. I woke up this morning, have no power in my building. In fact, I still have no power in my building. I've walked down 6 floors, I've walked up 6 floors, I've been shopping. And then I thought, my God, how am I ever going to tune into this lunch with no Wi-Fi power? And then I suddenly thought, oh, my cell phone is a hotspot. And I'm not very good at this, but I did get the hotspot going, and that's why I'm on, but a little late. Thank you.
Excellent. Glad you made it. Any other happy news? Only the happy kind. Okay, so we'll move on to duty assignments. Thank you, Dawn, for doing the bulletin today.